A group of construction workers enter a drainage system to do some repairs. It was pitch black and used various torches to make their way through the tunnel. After completing some hard work, they stop for a break and discuss the state of the nation. One of them, Gerald, starts going on a tangent about working with people of different races and culture. Gerald looks on disrespectfully at a 20-something Pakistani man called Tanvir and mumbles racial remarks underneath his breath. Tanvir stands up and confronts Gerald for his behavior. Gerald doesn't listen to him, and Tanvir, feeling outcasted by the other workmen, walks off into the tunnel. A couple miles down the tunnel, Tanvir starts hearing a beeping sound nearby and decides to look into it. He approaches a panel on the brick wall with flashing lights and switches. He curiously reaches his hand out to touch the panel, but then hears scuttling in the darkness and believes the workmen are playing a trick on him. He calls them out but with no reply, and then he turns round. A hand strikes him down to the ground and lands into the drain water. He then gets pulled up by the head and stares in horror at a shiny metallic figure. He screams in pain and the screams echoed through the tunnel. The TARDIS lands in a back street and Louisa emerges out. She was quite ecstatic about this. What she wasn't expecting was the weather to turn gloomy. Rubbish was mounting up in the streets and some of the people were carrying boards protesting. The Doctor walks out and was writing down a list. Louisa jokingly asks him if he's getting groceries. The Doctor informs her that he's looking for vinyl records he needs for his collection, and after the previous adventures involving the TARDIS falling out of flight, it's caused a good portion of the records to be damaged, so the Doctor is looking for replacements. Louisa says she's doing a bit tourism around the city and the Doctor kindly lets her go off. Louisa walks off and the Doctor is left on his own. He locks up the TARDIS and was about to walk off when a group of punks randomly set on him. They threatened the Doctor with their fists, cursing, and a wooden bat. The Doctor bluffs at this and tells to them clear. The punks disagree and pounces on him. The Doctor gets savagely beaten up and is knocked out. The punks steal his belongings, including the TARDIS key and the sonic screwdriver. They run off before anyone notices their actions and raced off down the street. The Doctor was lying in puddle, battered and bruised. Louisa was walking around the streets looking at shops which were closed due to the strikes happening. The Londoners were miserable and there was a negative energy lurking every corner. She witnesses a man in his mid-50s berating a couple of Nigerian women outside a block of flats for flooding their country with coloreds and that they should get a boat back to Africa. Louisa walked on away from the intensity and stops at a crossing waiting to carry on. A man in black clothing and sunglasses smoking a cigarette stood next to her. Louisa looked at him and retuned a smile. Both of them walked across the road and started a conversation. His name was Colin, a swerve greaser-like wanderer, and says to Louisa that he's prepping a revolution against the Conservative Party, especially Margaret Thatcher, who recently became Prime Minister. Louisa says she isn't interested in that sort of stuff, but Colin, with his charismatic personality, tempts her with the opportunity to get her to know London the way he does, being a guide for her. She accepts, but with caution, and Colin pleasantly shows her around. After showing off various places and walking round for a couple hours, Colin needs to go back to his place briefly for business reasons, and Louisa says she'll join him. They head to this nearby squat and Louisa see what Colin's motives are. Various pictures of Thatcher were placed all over the walls which had been defaced with slang words and swastikas. Anarchist symbols were sprayed painted in red and a few more people were sitting at a table scoring dope while Colin demonstrates his plotting. Louisa was getting anxiously reticent and decides to intervene with Colin's plans. He confronts her and starts getting sinister. Colin started to grab her and pull her around the squat furiously. She wanted to escape but Colin was holding her tightly. He then throws her in a room with a mattress on floor and locks her in. Louisa gets up, banging the door to be let out, and turns to see a woman lying on the mattress. The woman had bleached blonde hair. The mascara was dripping from the eyes and was wearing black lingerie. Louisa notices a needle sticking out of the left arm and was mortified at the sight. The woman had died from a heroin overdose. The Doctor awakes to find himself in a hospital bed. By his bedside was a mustached army officer with a Scottish accent and was reading a nature magazine. The army officer introduces himself as Colonel Robert O'Neill and is part of UNIT. The Doctor turned his back from O'Neill, facing the opposite direction, thinking UNIT are going recruit him back as their scientific advisor, and turns again to O'Neill. The Doctor flat out says no. Colonel O'Neill just smirks at this and pulls out a key with a chain. The Doctor realizes that Colonel O'Neill had retrieved the TARDIS key from the punks he encountered in the back street, and if he doesn't cooperate with UNIT he'll be stuck on Earth, similar to his exile from the Time Lords. The Doctor begrudging agrees, which satisfies Colonel O'Neill. The Doctor and Colonel O'Neill exit to the hospital, and to the Doctor's astonishment, when in the car park he sees his yellow roadster Bessie. The two head off to the unit headquarters, where they meet some of the task force, including Privates Tristan Briggs, Dermot Hobbs and Dawn Ferris, and Sergeant James Eriot. Colonel O'Neill brings the Doctor in a small conference room to discuss about recent disappearances involving the Drains, and the Doctor suspects if the Great Intelligence or the Cybermen are involved. Colonel O'Neill devises a plan, and that is to investigate the drainage system around London. The Doctor agrees to this and heads off to retrieve Bessie. Colin opens the door and instructs Louisa to go with him. She downright refuses, but Colin brings out a double-barred shotgun and threatens her. Louisa didn't have a choice and follows out with Colin and his associates to an unknown location. They meet up at a warehouse that's been left empty due to strike action, and inside were homemade explosives created courtesy of them owning a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook. While Colin and his anarchist associates were planning their move, Louisa started hearing a clanging sound coming from somewhere and sneaks over to a corner of the warehouse. She then discovers a metallic creature with a scorpion's tail scuttling around in the dark, and then set its sights her. She screamed in terror and raced to the warehouse entrance. Colin got hold her and scolding her for fleeing, thinking she was going to grass them up. One of the anarchists then pointed at the metallic creature that coming towards them and uses the tail on one of them, stabbing it the tip into one of the anarchist's foot, paralyzing instantly. Colin shot it twice with the shotgun, but to no prevail, and continued getting at the remaining anarchists. Louisa looked at the homemade explosives and panically requested Colin to use them. Colin quickly pondered, but to kill the creature he must use what he created, and frantically headed to the table. He managed to activate a small explosive and looked for the creature. No sign of it. Suddenly the tail sprung from under the table and stabbed Colin's foot. Colin grabbed the explosive when he fell and forcefully placed it on the creature. The explosive went off, killing both Colin and the creature. Louisa headed outside, still shaken of what had happened in the warehouse, and stood waiting on a street corner. She then notices the sound of a horn and looks on at yellow roadster with a couple of Land Rovers following behind it. It was the Doctor and UNIT. Louisa raced towards Bessie, relieved to see the Doctor, and hugged him for comfort. Colonel O'Neill questions her about the explosion in the warehouse, and Louisa mentions that there was a metallic creature lurking inside. The Doctor's eyes widen and quickly headed inside the warehouse, where he finds what him and UNIT are dealing. The Doctor examines the creature, which is revealed to be a Cybermet, and by the looks it a quite advanced version. Colonel O'Neill looks over the Doctor, mentions the Cybermen have somehow returned and that UNIT have supplied heavy firepower to battle against. The Doctor stood up and notices plans for an explosive assassination of Margaret Thatcher. He looks at a diagram and sees some directions to a nearby drainage system near the warehouse. The Doctor tells Colonel O'Neill that they need investigate the location and wonder if the Cybermen are in operation underneath the concrete. Nearby was a site under construction, and by the looks of things was empty. No workers to be seen, but their equipment and transport was still here. The Doctor and UNIT arrive and see the drain cover was off. The pulling equipment was still in operation but not being used, and the Doctor instructs that they head down into the system. One of the UNIT soldiers started operating the pulling equipment, and the Doctor, Colonel O'Neill and some of the UNIT soldiers were ready to go down. Louisa persuades the Doctor to join them, but Colonel O'Neill refuses to this, and the Doctor gives her a walkie-talkie so that she can communicate with them. Louisa accepts this, and the Doctor and UNIT were sent down below. The Doctor and UNIT walked through the tunnel. It was dark and the torches they were using started flickering rapidly, which was frustrating to them to navigate. Suddenly Private Briggs walks into someone dangling from the ceiling and panicked. Colonel O'Neill shined his torch to what it was and reveals to be a severed dog's head with its spine sticking out. Private Ferris started gagging at the sight, and Private Briggs childishly rubbed off some of the blood and fur off him. Louisa contacted the Doctor about their progress, and the Doctor mentions about the severed dog's head. They continued through the tunnel when a sound of electricity had echoed, and the Doctor the UNIT group to be cautious. Private Briggs and Hobbs approached Private Ferris and told her that if any goes haywire they'll be there for her. Both Briggs and Hobbs put one of their hands on her ass. Private Ferris let out a little gasp, and the Doctor, Colonel O'Neill and Sergeant Eriot looked back. Private Hobbs cheekily says it was for good luck, much to Private Ferris' annoyance. The doctor and unit entered a large base-like area where machines were in motion. They surveyed the area and saw body parts scattered around. Private Briggs and Hobbs were concerned that they might be next, but the doctor turns them. He reassures them that they won't end up converted or mutilated. Sergeant Eriot informs the doctor of a computer and the doctor heads over. He discovers the Cybermen are plotting another invasion similar to one previously with Tobias Vaughn, and in an act of prevention he brings out the sonic screwdriver, presses it and sabotages the computer, destroying all the security. Colonel O'Neill demands what the doctor's plan is and the doctor just says to get captured, much to the horror of the unit group. A metal door slides open and out emerges a sextet of Cybermen. The doctor observes them and knows it's a different factions to ones he met previously. The Cybermen here were bulky, hastily mangled with machinery, and had two different faces. One was more akin to the Mondasians and the other one was reminiscent of the ones the doctor encounter in the death zone on Gallifrey. The Cybermen order the doctor and unit to follow them to the conversion chamber. The doctor agrees to this, much to the negative response of Colonel O'Neill. They enter the conversion chamber where there were hundreds of booths containing humans being in the process of converted. The doctor looked forward and notices a figure in black tending to a brain in a jar. The figure screwed the jar shut and then turned to the doctor. The figure was a man that was partly converted like a Mondasian Cyberman and wore black overalls. The hands were crinkled and grey like it was devoid of blood, a sort of mix between Davros and Sherazjek. The cybernetic man spoke to the doctor in its modulated voice and asked why did he sabotage the computer. The doctor spoke up saying he's going to stop the incoming invasion and that he'll destroy the base with the Cybermen in it. The cybernetic man says the process is nearly completed and looks over at the unit group, seeing potential in inventing for more conversions. Colonel O'Neill objects to this and pulls out his handgun and points it at the cybernetic man. The cybernetic man says Colonel O'Neill is foolish and will be reprimanded to be first of the conversion process. The doctor pleads to the cybernetic man not to proceed. Suddenly the doctor's walkie-talkie started interfering and the cybernetic man reached to the doctor's pocket to obtain it. Louisa was on the other end trying to communicate and the cybernetic man answers, sending chills through her bones. Louisa demands the doctor shouldn't be harmed and the cybernetic man replies that he wouldn't get harmed, just upgraded. The cybernetic man crushes the walkie-talkie with his hand into pieces. The cybernetic man orders the Cybermen to take the unit group to the conversion chamber and proceed to upgrade them. The unit group were taken through another door and leaves the doctor on his own. The cybernetic man wants to analyze the doctor's mind to discover what secrets he's holding and his knowledge of the Cybermen. The unit group entered a factory-like section of the base. Dead bodies were being worked on with machines inserting and extracting various organs with cybernetic implants. Colonel O'Neill tries to escape out of one of the Cybermen's grasp but gets his left broken in the process and was placed in one of the chambers. Privates Briggs, Hobbs and Ferris along with Sergeant Eriot were also placed in these. The doctor sat tied in a chair with wires connected to his head and the cybernetic was ready to analyze his mind. The analyze was painful with the doctor holding in the pain he was enduring and the cybernetic was looking at the screen seeing the doctor various incarnations. The screen also showed various companions, enemies and adventures. The doctor was still holding in his pain and his face was going lightly red. He managed to speak up to the cybernetic man that he's encountered the Cybermen many times and even saw their genesis on Mondas. The cybernetic man rose up and confronts the doctor. The cybernetic man tells him that his father was one of the people of Mondas who helped develop the Cybermen and after his father's death he became obsessed with creating his own versions based on concepts his father had been working on. He also mentioned he influenced a couple of non-converted Mondasians to help them with early prototypes but the project fell apart. Factions formed on different planets and galaxies because they believed they can outdo him, making him determined to make the definitive Cyberman. The doctor abounded with a remark that they couldn't find a solution for their weakness, mentioning solvents, radiation, gravity-based technology and gold. The cybernetic man then whacked the doctor in the left side of his face and fell to the floor still tied to the chair. The cybernetic man kneeled above the doctor and relented that this faction of Cybermen will be superior amongst the ones the doctor faced over his lives. The doctor just stayed silent thinking how to get out of this situation. In the conversion chamber Colonel O'Neill was wired to a metal table and two small drills appeared between his head. One of the Cybermen was operating the controls and pushed a few flashing buttons. The two small drills entered Colonel O'Neill's skull. He let out a raspy Scottish scream and blood started spewing out of his skull. The Cyberman looked on and watched the early process of the conversion, surgically removing the skin and bone to access the brain. Private Briggs and Hobbs were covered with wires and fluid was entering their bodies. The fluid was to sedate the victims and during conversion removes all pain and feeling. Private Hobbs was sedated but had his senses intact and watched Private Ferris getting the worst of them. Lying on a similar metal table, Cybermen were performing intense surgery on her, removing her ovaries and dumping them in a pile of sterilized rags. Once it was complete, the Cyberman placed her in a conversion chamber and started. Private Briggs started lose his memories, his family and friends wiping out. Sergeant Erios' limbs were dismembered and replaced with cybernetic ones. The Cybermen were looking at the new recruits of their army and started plotting an emergence onto the streets of London. The Doctor looked at the cybernetic MSN as it returned to its computer, observing its stages for an invasion of London, and looked at a few items next to it, one of them being the comic screwdriver. The Doctor shuffled the wires and tried to free his right hand. He managed with some struggle and his ring was activated. The sonic screwdriver flung itself to the Doctor's hand and the Doctor released himself. The cybernetic man saw this and raised the alarm. The Doctor raced to the door of the conversion chamber and entered. The Doctor was mortified by the sight of the partly converted unit group. They were moaning while still sedated like they were brain dead and apologized for their demise. The room suddenly turned red. SND. The Cybermen started to emerge from the shadows. The Doctor quickly outmaneuvered them and sabotaged their technology. Explosions around and the Doctor quickly escaped the conversion chamber. The Doctor headed for the tunnel to reach the entrance and climbed up. The cybernetic man suddenly emerged and grabbed the Doctor's ankle. Louisa popped her head in to assist the Doctor. She locked eyes with the cybernetic man who gave a gravely stare to her and she backed away from she was trying to do. The Doctor struggled to reach the surface and notices a large blaze coming for them. The Doctor violently shakes his ankle to loosen the cybernetic man's grasp and the cybernetic man lost the grip, falling to the ground. The Doctor continued to reach the surface and the cybernetic man stood up only to be engulfed in the oncoming blaze. The Doctor was shot up by the blaze and landed face first onto the ground. The smell of gas and smoke engulfed the construction site. Louisa came to his aid and pulled him to safety. The Doctor was now burdened that he couldn't save the unit group and he that let the organization down. Louisa comforts him and slowly reassures him that he couldn't find a way to help them but prevented an invasion. The Doctor came to his senses and agreed to Louisa's words. The Doctor and Louisa retuned to the TARDIS. The Doctor looked in disgust at what he saw. The TARDIS was covered in posters of Margaret Thatcher with her eyes crossed out and sticking her two fingers up. The Doctor ripped out of some of them to reach the door handle and entered. Louisa followed in and when the TARDIS dematerializes the posters burned into ashes, leaving a burned paper trail and some of it floated into the air.